Well, it appears that Trump voters aren't the only ones receiving the Fell For It Again award, as Prime Minister Mark Carney is also a recipient. So in this video, I'm going to go over how Mark Carney fell for it again, as well as just the disaster that this Prime Minister has been in the first 100 days. So let me first start by acknowledging the obvious. I'm glad it's the Liberals in power and not the Conservatives. Now, let me get to the reality of the situation. It's hard to imagine how much worse it could be than what is happening so far. So this is a prime minister who came in on the idea that we're going to have our elbows up. We're going to fight Donald Trump tooth and nail. We're going to form our own path and ensure that Canada is strong, and we're not going to bow to the Americans and have them run all over us. And since coming into power, Trump has run all over Mark Carney. Let's get to the obvious example, the most recent obvious example. A few weeks ago, this is from June 27th, Donald Trump said that he wants Canada to cancel their digital services tax that was about to go into effect. That would largely target American Silicon Valley companies, though it wasn't aimed at them. It was any tech company making over 20 million a year. So, Facebook, Amazon, Google would all apply. And what did Canada do? They basically ran as fast as they could a couple days later to rescind the digital service tax, to advance broader trade negotiations. We'll get to that. Here is how the White House framed this whole thing when it happened.
It's very simple. Prime Minister Carney in Canada caved to President Trump in the United States of America. And President Trump knows how to negotiate, and he knows that he is governing the best country and the best economy in this world, on this planet. And every country on the planet needs to have good trade relationships with the United States. And it was a mistake for Canada to vow to implement that tax that would have hurt our tech companies here in the United States. The president made his position quite clear to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister called the president last night to let the president know that he would be dropping that tax, which is a big victory for our tech companies and our American workers here at home.
That is the press secretary saying that Carney and Canada caved to Donald Trump. But it's okay. We can take this on the chin because three-dimensional chess. Mark Carney knows what he is doing. He's simply giving Trump this win so that they could have a fantastic deal. 2 weeks later, less than 2 weeks later, Trump threatens 35% Canada tariff, floats higher blanket rates. How'd that work out for you? Now, it's not as if we should be surprised by this. I mean, I shouldn't have to reference reporting because it's common knowledge, but there was reporting back on June 30th. Why did Canada just cave to Trump by scrapping the digital service tax? This will simply embolden Trump, which it clearly did. So canceling this tax means we threw away $7 billion onto Trump's poker table, the expected 5-year haul from the digital service tax, simply to keep playing a rigged game with no clear end. What was gained here? $7 billion lost in revenue over 5 years, canceling this, to just be hit with 35% tariffs across the board. And this tax, by the way, worth mentioning, regular Canadians would have been unaffected, as the tax applies mainly to business transactions with no relationship to job or consumer prices. But here is Mark Carney's response to Trump and the 35%. Throughout the current trade negotiations with the U.S., the Canadian government has steadfastly defended our workers and businesses. We will continue to do so as we work towards the revised deadline of August 1st. Canada has made vital progress to stop this scourge of fentanyl in North America. Why should I even have to keep reading? In the second paragraph, already immediately giving in to Trump's framing around fentanyl at the border when we know that is complete bullshit. Endless reporting on how much bullshit. The RCMP commissioner says there's no data that fentanyl is moving south in mass quantities. An American investigation on this found that quantities coming from Canada are negligible. This is a completely non-issue. Yet we have the Prime Minister of Canada feeding into Trump's bullshit narrative for why there's even a fight to begin with. It's so absurd to see, on one hand, the press secretary be willing to say something like Canada caved, yet on the other, this is the fighter that we have? Clownish. But here is arguably worse, maybe, is how Mark Carney is now framing what his plan for Canada is.
I have a simple rule: spend less, invest more. Let's say you buy a home. The down payment and the mortgage cost a lot up front, but your home builds value over time. That's an investment. Now you still have other bills like heat and electricity. You need them, but they don't make you better off in the long run. Those are operational expenses. I will balance our operational budget in 3 years. We'll spend what we need to with the money we already have. And we'll do things that encourage the big investments that create jobs and grow our economy, like building millions of homes, making Canada a clean energy superpower, and creating new trade routes so we're not dependent on the United States. Spend less, invest more.
All right. So this is how he spoke during the campaign as well. Spend less, invest more. But you're going to see where so far these investments are going and what these cuts actually are. It's worth noting just the ridiculous analogy at the beginning there, where he says, oh, your home's an investment, but your heating and electricity, you don't really need that. If you don't pay your heating bill and your electricity bill, it's not going to be a good experience for you. So he's saying we're cutting those expenses, things that you need to survive in your home, but you're still going to have the home. Okay, I'm glad we have the home, but are we going to be okay? This is the reality of what he wants to do now. They're looking for 7.5% cuts across the board. And it's actually worse than that. So ministers are being asked to reduce program spending by 7.5% in the fiscal year that begins in April, followed by 10% the year after and 15% in 2028 to 2029. Quote, it's just a matter of how much pain will that inflict on public servants and on Canadians. That's from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So an analysis of the Liberal plan from their campaign, which was actually half of the cuts than what they are doing now. So the cuts are more than double, or about double, from where the cuts were initially going to be, already said that at the time they need to rethink this because these cuts are insane. So this is from David McDonald, going on to say at the time it was supposed to be $13 billion in quote unquote savings. It is now $25 billion. So for cuts this deep, again, this was for the $13 billion. It would require across the board job losses and major service reductions. In other words, if it proceeded, it would represent a major disruption to federal public services and would rival the 18.9% cut in operation expenditures of Paul Martin's 95 budget as the most extreme budget slashing in Canadian history. And now it's double that. So McDonald was asked by the Toronto Star for an update on his thoughts, saying that the scale of the savings exercise is much higher than expected. That raises significant questions, he said, including whether funding for Indigenous communities, foreign aid, and more could be subject to cuts. Quote, now this is reaching into grants, contributions, transfers to other levels of government, to nonprofits. There's just a lot more on the table now. So the scale of these cuts, we aren't even really clear on exactly how this is going to impact us, because right now this is still in the asking stage. They're being asked to find these cuts, so we're going to find out later exactly what this means for us. But we are talking most cuts in Canadian history, already, which was already the case at what it was before. Now it's double that. We have to imagine things aren't going to be too great for us. But don't worry. Carney is committing to Canada spending the most, or I should say the biggest increase in military spending since the Second World War. Doubling the budget by 2035. So cuts to public services, massive job losses, but it's okay. We're spending more on the military, which is still only going to be a fraction, a tiny little fraction of what the U.S. has, which I think it's fair to argue right now is our biggest worry. We have no hope of ever going to war, winning a war with the U.S. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some sort of focus in some way on defense, and an insurance there, and I understand it. It makes Canadians feel better to know that we have some investment in defense. I understand that, but to what end? So, to this end, Ottawa is set to award a major defense contract for night vision binoculars, despite industry concerns that its requirements are written in a way that all but assures a single U.S. company is eligible. So, cutting services to Canadians, increasing military spending, where at least a portion of that is going directly to U.S. companies. I'm trying to understand where the benefit is here, how this is elbows up. Not to mention, recently this came out, I thought it was worth pulling into this story. Canadian Armed Forces members accused of forming anti-government militia, plotting to take land in Quebec. So there are clearly some cultural issues, I guess you could say, some issues within Canadian Armed Forces that clearly need to be addressed. And I'd be surprised if this was the extent of the problems there. But we're giving more money to a group that maybe right now aren't in the greatest place. But you could say, hey, this is a one-off thing. This isn't a broader issue. I would disagree with you. But still, just arguing on the fact that handing money to U.S. defense contractors, handing money to the military while cutting everywhere else, I fail to see how this is benefiting the vast majority of Canadians. I want to end on this. I just want to share. I'm not going to play this video for you, but I want you to go watch it. This is On the Breach. They do fantastic investigative work. They did a recent review of Carney's first 100 days. I will link to this below the video in the description box. It is absolutely worth watching for a proper critique and analysis of Mark Carney from a working class, progressive, left-wing perspective, not a right-wing BS world perspective, but an actual fair critique of Mark Carney. It's worth checking it out, so I will link to that below the video.